Welcome to The Conversation, a podcast about technology, instructional design, and the learning sciences. Our main topic this week is on assessment, but we're going to start with a discussion on productive failure. And throughout this semester, we've talked in class about this notion of failure and this thing that keeps coming up about how do we handle failure within instructional design. Oftentimes it's seen as something that is bad. We don't like failing, but an argument can also be made about failure being a good thing because it helps us learn more. So that's kind of what productive failure is about. And I've always wanted to include this topic in this class and haven't had a chance. So this is the first time that this class will be talking about productive failure. And so there just happens to be a special issue in the journal Thinking Skills and Creativity that was all about productive failure. So I provided the class with a packet that they can pick from. So that's kind of what we're going to be starting with, and then we're going to talk more about assessment. Before we start, we have two guests this week. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself? So let's start with you, Jeanell.
My name is Jeanell, and this is my first year as a grad student at Adelphi University as a educational technology major. I am a preschool teacher. It's my first year teaching, and I had graduated about a year and a half ago, and now I'm here.
And Shannon, you've joined us before. Is there anything you want to add?
Just that I am also my first semester in this grad program. I'm a special education teacher for students with moderate to severely special needs. They range from 16 to 19, and I'm excited to be here.
Well, let's start with productive failure. Jeanell, you said you read the Anderson article from the Productive Failure, right? What did you think about the concept?
I thought the concept was interesting. It was a lot different than other approaches, like the usual direct instruction approach. I found that I wasn't too sure about, not giving homework and having the lecture and, well, not lecture, but the lesson spread out. I wasn't too sure about that. But then when the post-test came along, they did better than the direct instruction group. So I was on the fence, and my thoughts, were back and forth about it.
Yeah, I think I'm in pretty much the same boat. I think that it is a good approach and provides a lot of creativity doing the productive failure method. I just don't know if I could see it being successful with like every type of class. For example, like with my students, I can't imagine this being successful for me, but I think because my students are so developmentally delayed and cognitively impaired. But I feel like in older grades and high school classes, I could see this being a beneficial approach for the students and for the teachers to kind of provide some freedom for the students.
What did you learn about productive failure from the readings? You had different readings. So you said you read the Anderson article from the Productive Failure. And you don't have to summarize the whole thing, but like just big takeaways, I guess.
Well, for me, since the productive failure in this reading went with, it was based on video games, it was actually pretty interesting because it promoted learning a different way. So the game is set up so that it's detecting whether or not you're failing. And then it progressively gets a little easier and set up so that you can later on progressively get successful after failing. In the article, it actually said pleasantly frustrating. So it pleasantly made them frustrating by wanting them to keep going.
Do either of you play games outside of school, I mean?
Not really for me, no.
No, not really.
Yeah, not
Okay.
really my thing.
But I chose it because I thought that it was interesting by just reading the abstract.
There's a school of thought with regards to game-based learning that looks at how games, and usually they mean video games, computer games, something like that, commercial video games, how they're designed for learning. If you think about it, all of these games require that you learn how to play, right? And through the learning how to play, you often involves failing multiple times. Why is it that people are attracted to gaming, even though it's built around this notion of failure? Why do people keep going back to games? In fact, a complaint, I know they cite G, and one of the things G talks about is that a complaint that gamers will have is that games are too easy. Like that's like, if a game is too easy, that's considered a bad game. Now, if you think about this in a school context, you would almost never hear a student say, well, this class is too easy.
Right.
Is it possible for instructional designers, teachers, to design something like game using whatever model, productive failure being one of them, to motivate students to be engaged with the class in a similar way, not being afraid of failing, wanting the challenge, and so on? So that's kind of the question. I don't know if found the problem yet. I don't think it's strictly having to do with instructional design either. So I think that's kind of where they're coming from. So yeah, Jeanell, I mean, I think your summary got to the main points. Like it's designed around, because games are designed around failing. So I think the idea is that students are learning something as they figure out how to do it. And so can you just briefly describe the game, like what it's supposed to teach?
The game, that was about, they were separated into 3 to 4 groups, and they had to engage in a discussion first on how to like stop this virus.
Okay.
And they had to investigate the role of failure and learning in a camp.
I mean, I don't know if that's what the students have to do, but I think that's what the research is trying to do.
Yes, yeah.
The students are just playing the game.
Yes.
Right? Shannon, what about your article?
So my article was about these 8th grade students that did like a whole class discussion on the temperature of like a glass of milk that was like it was warmed quickly and then more slowly as it approached room temperature. So basically it was just using the productive failure approach, and talked about how they initially produced non-normative explanations, but by the end of the discussion and the class, they had like changed their thoughts and their ideas into like a different explanation that was more scientific, showing like the relationship with Newton's law of heating. So basically the whole article was just on using that approach and how failure can really play a large role when students are being creative and making sense of things.
What did you think about the article in general?
I liked it. I think it was a good example, which went right toward what I was kind of confused about with the readings, is that I can see how this approach can be really beneficial with science or math or things that kind of like I just feel like can be discussed easier. I can't like foresee this approach being used in like a history lesson or a social studies lesson. So that's kind of one of the questions that I wrote down, is that I can't imagine it. Maybe I need a better example, but I can't imagine it being as productive in those subjects.
I could see where she's coming from, because in math, you're doing a lot of collaborating and you're working together. Meanwhile, in history, it's all about facts. And I'm not really a big history person, so I find that history tends to be a lot of like lectures, and it could be debate as well. So that's why it's hard for me to see how it could be implemented in a history class as well.
I mean, you're right that history is often taught around facts, but that's typically not the ideal way to teach history. As far as I know, like when last week's reading, when I talked to Christine about core ideas, I don't know if you remember in the Wiggins and McTighe reading, there's this figure of 3 concentric circles. The one that is least important are the facts. The most important, the core ideas, would be the historical thinking that goes on, with the understanding that history and social studies shouldn't be taught just around facts, but should be taught around ideas, arguments, processes. And so in that sense, it's kind of like science, although it's often taught around facts because for any number of reasons, sometimes for test reasons, sometimes because it's easier to assess. That's another problem.
So I actually have a comment on that. So in the past, while observing and student teaching, and I know this is kind of going off track, but just as a comment, I noticed that social studies and history is not spent on as much as it should be. And that's probably the reason why I feel like I can't see the approach being used in history where math and writing and literacy is being spent on more. I'm not sure if you see that too, Shannon, but...
Yeah, I agree. I don't see it as much, in my school especially, but I think they do put a lot of energy into math and reading, but I think that's more so because that's like the core foundation. Yeah, and I think the reason that this approach is difficult in history is because if it was in math, students can all take different approaches but get to the answer. Same with science, like they can all take a different approach, but there's like an ultimate goal. Whereas I feel like with history, like we were saying, like it is just facts, or there's only one answer to it. It's like it has to be this. So I just think that the collaborative piece in history is a little bit more difficult.
I remember a game that was a modded game, which means they took a commercial game and they kind of adapted it. And there was a game called Revolution, I think it was called. It was designed on using a game called Neverwinter Night engine, which allows you to create mods. Neverwinter Night is a role-playing game, and the game Revolution was designed to teach you about the American Revolution. And I think what you are allowed to do is that you get to role-play different characters and go around talking to other characters, some who want independence and others who are royalists. The idea is that the struggle for independence was not simply reading through the history, but also understanding the processes. There are different ways you can learn history, right? I'm guessing neither of you are history buffs, or
definitely not.
No,
just
not
based
at all.
on based on how you talk about it. Because if you approach history as in what happened in what day with whom, that can be really dry. And I think that's probably where history and social studies often fails to engage students. But I think once you're able to show students that, like, the why and how, like, why did this event happen? Not that it happened, but why it happened in the way it did. What else could have happened? I think that becomes a lot more interesting, and that opens up the inquiry part that might have some place for productive failure to enter. So I think it's definitely not as straightforward in terms of, like, if you want to use productive failure. But I do think there is a room for that. I'm actually kind of curious. I know Brooke, who hopefully listens to these podcasts, we'll see. She teaches literature. I'm kind of curious about whether she would think literature, because you can kind of make the same argument that literature is just about books.
Yeah, same thing.
Maybe she can see a space in there.
The one thing that I did find interesting about this approach, about the productive failure approach, was that they were given no homework. And that was actually one of my questions. And if homework was essential to learning, and since productive failure doesn't require, I think from what I read, it seemed like they didn't say that homework was required for this kind of approach, but I don't know. I feel like with the test scores, with the post-test scores, I felt like it was odd that, yes, they did good on the homework, but then when it came to the post-test, it was like they did the other approach, direct instruction approach, they did far more better on the post-test.
This is the other article, right? This is the website.
Yeah, this is the website.
About the homework component, I think it depends on what the homework is. So, like, I'm just thinking back to, like, when I was in school, and, like, a lot of paper homework when I would come home in elementary school, like, I don't know that was completely beneficial for me. But I think if we could make homework more meaningful, more, like, engaging, I think that there would be a better response and it would be more essential. I don't personally, like, my students don't go home with homework. Again, I know my population is different. I think that if, you're sending students home with packets of work every night, I don't think that's beneficial. So I think it really just depends on, like, the type of homework they're giving, how engaging it is.
I don't think productive failure necessarily includes or excludes homework. I think that's just something they did. I think the idea, because it's a study, they want to make sure that the reader knows whether they're getting any additional work. So they're trying to say that all the work they're doing was in class. And I think, did the other group have homework? Direct instruction, I'm trying to think.
I thought they did have
homework. Oh, they did? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Lecture practice. Okay, so I think they were just trying to say what time, because you also want to make sure that one group isn't spending significantly more time on the work than the other group. Otherwise, your study is going to be off. I think the point they were trying to make with the post-test, though, is that the group that didn't do the productive failure, they did well on the simple tests, but they did poorly comparatively when they did the post-test, which had simple and complex problems. And I think that's their point. They're saying that the short-term versus the long-term learning, right? That's kind of towards the end of their end of that article, where they say that they both have benefits and drawbacks. But I think if you want students to learn something, not just for the immediate thing that they're doing, like a test or something, but you want them to kind of retain it over time, then productive failure does a better job at longer term and also more complex problems. I think that's kind of their argument.
I have one thing to add. So this was really just a thought. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to what I'm about to say. But so I really think the productive failure approach is great. Like you were saying, I could see the long-term benefits of it more than short-term. I think that productive failure kind of takes out the component of like a sit-down paper test, though. And I just know, like I wrote, to become a teacher, you have to take tons of certification tests. So I just wonder that if, I feel like productive failure can't be the only way of instruction, because like if we like it or not, some professions and some times of life we're going to have to take tests. So I wonder if, tests weren't around anymore and no teachers use tests anymore, if that would really set people back for their future, because we can't really escape sometimes that we have to take tests. It's just something I've seen, like a lot of my students obviously opt out of New York State testing and things like that. And for them, obviously, they're not going to be taking tests down the line for their careers. But some students in like high schools and middle schools like that are opting out of testing, I see the benefits of that. But I also see that it could be setting them back for the future if they're not exposed to testing. Unfortunately, we can't completely escape testing.
Sure.
So just something I was thinking about.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I feel like that's setting a little bit of, when they get into college, when they get into, for us, going into school for wanting to be a teacher, there are numerous tests. And not just that, if you want to become anything nowadays, there are tests that you need to be able to pass to actually, get into that career. So I think that testing is quite important to me, but in some cases, like if they are opting out with the test, I guess that's their choice and their parents' choice, I feel like.
I know, I agree with you. I think, and that's actually a perfect segue into the Chapter 7 reading, because testing is just one kind of assessment, right? It's not recommended to use only one type of assessment. So I really like the chart or the figure on page 152, the continuum of assessments, because it shows you like all the different types of assessments that should be part of your collection of assessments within a unit or within a class. And I think the analogy that they use about snapshot versus a scrapbook is important, because all of these assessments on their own, they are snapshots. They have like it's their snapshot in time, like a test, or like in this class, you have the informal quiz you took last week or 2 weeks ago, right? And then you have your weekly assessments, and then you have like the hands-on stuff. So all of these are different assessment. And if that was the only assessment that only tells me one thing about you, right? And so I think I would see tests being a part of that. So I would agree with you. I think that students do need that exposure just so you can even things out. Because maybe some people are also not good test takers, and but that doesn't mean they should never take a test in their lives, right? Just because, as you said, they have to take it at some point, probably. I noticed that in both cases they talked about, or they shared the conversations that the people involved were having in the game. They were showing how the gamers were talking about what they did when they failed and what to do, and what it meant. And then in the creative thinking reading, they also shared kind of the back and forth between the participants. I was wondering like what you thought about being able to see them unpack their failures versus when you get a test and you see only the answer, what the process of what the conversation helped you understand?
I think the conversation was like my favorite part because it makes what I'm reading feel real. And I felt like I was able to connect with a lot of what students were saying. And I think that like when you fail, so you always learn something from when you fail, regardless if it's good or bad. So I felt like, hearing them explain, why they were wrong or what they noticed, I thought was really helpful. And I think that is like a learning experience in itself. I think it's interesting also to see what one student says versus what another student says. It just shows how everybody thinks differently. And yeah, I thought that part was really helpful.
For me, it was quite interesting actually, because seeing as since it was a game, you're seeing them talk about the game, and you actually saw them collaborating with one another and actually helping one another out, which I thought was really interesting to see. And I watched my brother play video games, and but I'm not hearing what the other person is saying, and seeing it written out and reading it, it's interesting to actually see. And when they are collaborating with one another, it's they're not just collaborating with one another. Actually, there was one participant who was saying, is this one hard? This one, it's pretty easy for me. So giving each other their thoughts on what they're actually playing as well, I thought was pretty interesting.
Being able to hear their thinking process is very helpful in understanding what they're struggling with and kind of what they're getting out of it, which you don't always see with assessment. I think that's one thing about the productive failure part of that, you are able to create these opportunities for them to talk about. Even in the other article, they talked about the importance of having people in groups, right? Because they can talk to each other. So I think that's another part to keep in mind, is that it's a group collaborative assignment, not a solitary one, which is oftentimes what schools tend to emphasize, kind of assessing individual, but not so much the process and the group aspect of it.
Yeah, and I like to make a comment about my article and how it made me think after reading it. And since there was a lot of collaboration amongst the people who were playing the game, that collaboration seems to go hand in hand with everything, not just with your workplace, businesses, but also in gaming too. And I never thought about that when it came to playing a game and being able to collaborate with one another.
So let's move on to the other reading.
I think I briefly touched on GRASS before during my undergrad, but I did like figure 7.5 about the different types of evidence, and it made me think about what do I really use in my classroom, and when I student taught, what did I really see? And I realized that, it was really a lot of informal checks for understanding rather than like quizzes and tests, because when student teaching, there were really only tests towards like the end of the month, towards the end of the unit. But yeah, I noticed that we definitely use a lot more informal checks for understanding. And as a teacher now, yeah, it's only pre-K, but trying to get them into kindergarten, I do use a lot of informal checks for understanding.
What type of assessments do you use now, or just examples?
Now, so I do a lot of examining my students' work. So I'm not sure if you guys have listened to, I forgot what question it was on the voice thread, but I work in a different kind of school where it is a different kind of approach. It's called Reggio Emilia approach. So it's an approach where students are using more of their creativity, where they're building more of their independence, and we don't use a lot of technology actually. And meanwhile, I'm going to school for educational technology, but we use a lot of repurposed materials. So with that, I am always observing as well. And then since they are such a young age, making sure that their cognitive skills are aligned with the stage that they're at as well.
It's funny because I had recently just had a meeting with my principal, and she was saying how she wants to make assessments really like the driving force in each teacher's classroom. She doesn't feel that she sees it enough as a whole in the building, and she wanted to, get my input on what I thought about that. So now that we just did all these readings, I can't wait to bring them back to her. But I think the best takeaway is the formative assessments. I think that is like the most essential component in a classroom. So I have to obviously take a lot of data on my students' IEP goals. So a lot of times, like after a lesson, since it's fresh in my head, I kind of like just go to the back. Students might be taking like a brain break, and I just like go through their goals that I have lined up in the back, and will just take quick data on how they did. Some like just teacher observations that I can see. And I also, at the end of every lesson, pretty much, I ask students to just tell me something that they learned in that half hour, whether they write it down, they tell me, they draw a picture of something, just to kind of see, what they're taking away from what I'm giving. And then I think, I don't even know if it directly really said it in this entire chapter, but something that I'm just learning from this entire class is that there's such a connection between the goal and the assessment. So like, I just feel like we've talked a lot about setting, clear goals and expectations. And I think that assessment goes hand in hand with that. So yeah, that's just what I had taken away, and something that I think I need to do better of, to be honest with you, with assessments, really aligning it to the goal to make sure that we are getting the data that we really need to be measured.
I liked the figure 7.3 on page 151. I thought the comparison between thinking like an assessor, which is the title of the chapter, versus thinking like an activity designer. I think it's very easy to think of it like an activity designer, especially if you're starting off, I guess. You think about like, what test should I give? What are the grades and, all that stuff. And if you want to think like an assessor, it would help to have a shift in your thinking in terms of, what are the goals? And it's just kind of what you were talking about, Shannon. What are the goals, and what are the things that would help you identify whether the goals were met or not?
I feel like it is very easy to be an activity designer. I think being an assessor, thinking like an assessor, is definitely something that needs to be more worked on. And that's where I proposed my question. There's an example in the chapter about the 100th day of school, and kindergartners had to put 100 items obviously on a poster and bring it in. And they say how that doesn't really measure the goal that they really need to, reach. It just shows that they can count to 100. It doesn't show that they can, make rows of 10. And it just made me think, is finding the right assessments more difficult when you're working with younger students, or like students like I work with? Because I feel like it is difficult to not make it so much of like an activity when you're working with those kind of students. So that's just something that I was thinking about. I would imagine it to be harder to create the best assessments for younger grades or students with disabilities and special needs. I feel like you have to have that fun activity component a lot of the times to keep them engaged. So I just wonder if that would be more challenging.
What do you think, Jeanell? This is right up.
This is right up my alley.
Yeah.
So I completely agree. When it comes to assessments in my classroom, and I student taught in higher grades. Actually, I student taught in 2nd grade and 5th grade, and going down to working with pre-K, it was I had to rethink my whole entire. Not rethink my whole entire vision, but rethink how I would, time management and classroom instruction and whatnot. But as far as assessments, I do find it a little not difficult, but I have to make sure that it's an appropriate assessment where it's a little more fun, actually, where they, get more engaged because they can't stick with they can't sit down for such a long time. Meanwhile, I mean, my kids could sit down for like a good half an hour, but making sure that my assessment is fun is definitely something that I need to have to do. But I did find that when I did student teach that doing assessments were easier with them, because you're able to do like a self check-in, or you can even do check-ins in different ways, like a self-assessment or participation assessment. So yeah, I would say that it's a little harder, but then again, there's ways to make it a little more fun for the little ones.
What did you think about the kindergarten teacher with the 100-item example?
So with that, I actually was going to write about that in my aha moment, but I didn't end up writing about that. Okay. I felt like the project could have been different, and I didn't think that it actually they made it fun, but it didn't. It was just really counting to 100, and it wasn't actually, going more in depth with trying to assess whether or not they knew more about 100, the number 100. So, and I think that's actually what Shannon had wrote either in her voice thread, or it was in her aha moment, actually.
It's just funny because I actually did that exact 100th day of school project when I was in kindergarten. And that's kind of what I mean when I say I think teachers need to be exposed to learning about more meaningful assessments. I think that we need to be like taught more, maybe having more workshops or professional developments centered around assessment, because I think that it's extremely important to realize that, okay, as that activity is fun, it really didn't show what we need to find out, what we need the students to be achieving.
You mentioned your principal, was it, who wanted to do more assessment, or thought that the classes should have more assessment or something like that?
Yeah, I think where she's coming from at that is that, like I said, all of our students have IEPs, so they have their own goals. And a lot of the times, if she meets with a teacher and asks them, how do you know that they reached that goal? A lot of the teachers don't have appropriate data on it. So she really wants to implement more, meaningful assessments that can really show and measure if the student is really achieving that specific goal.
Do you know what advice you would give her based on the reading this week?
I think the biggest thing is that you need to make sure your assessment is matching the goal. Like, I think that we need to think of it as, okay, if we're saying the student can answer WH questions, then we need to make sure that the assessment is surfaced on WH questions, not just something not related to the, main point of the goal. So I think that would be the biggest thing I could explain. And then also the whole component of formative assessments, because it's obviously very easy to forget as teachers at the end of the day what happened. So just like a constant check and a constant check for understanding to see where the students are at.
One of my questions was, do you think that GRASP would be an efficient tool to measure students' understanding, proficiency, and knowledge? And then I went on asking other questions about like self-assessment, and do you think self-assessments are beneficial for students to identify if their knowledge is weak, they need help, or if they're actually grasping what they learned?
So one question was, do you think that GRASP would be an effective tool? So GRASP would be the acronym for goal, role, audience, situation, performance, and standards. What do you think, Shannon?
I do think that it would be an effective tool, kind of based on what I've just been saying about that line between the goal and the assessment. So, I think that it would be an extremely effective tool to make sure that students are proficient and really comprehending
this is Jeanell's question, what do you feel about self-assessments? Like, I think self-assessments might be something that would be useful across grades even if it's not a super metacognitive thing. I think having them be able to judge for themselves, I think it's really helpful. Do you use any kind of self-assessment in your classes?
I mean, now I use kind of a self-assessment where, coming in from student teaching with, a higher grade, and then going into pre-K, I try to use self-assessment similar to what I know. So I do use the 1, 2, 3. So I'm not sure if you know what that one. I'm sure you know what that is, Shannon. Where 1, you need a lot of help. 2, you kind of get it, but you need a little more help. And 3, I completely understand it and I don't need help. So I kind of use that in a way in my classroom where my students, I only do 1 and 2. 1, if they need help, and then 2, I'm okay, I don't need help. And that obviously depends on what we're doing at the time. But I feel like self-assessments are absolutely great in classrooms where there's different kinds of self-assessments that are out there.
How do you usually present this assessment to your students? Is it an exit ticket, or is it just like a question that you ask them?
Yeah. In between the lessons, I would just go ahead and give me a 1 if you need help, and 2 if you don't need help. So that's how I would use it in my class.
I've seen teachers put similar things, like some kind of polling thing on, popsicle sticks or something that they can hold up that only you can see. That sometimes I think that makes them feel a little bit less self-conscious, if you think that's an issue. So I was just kind of curious about how they give you that information and whether you notice that maybe they would say they understand when they don't or anything like that.
There are ones who will not raise their hand at all because they're way too shy, and that's understandable at that age. So what I do is I do a different type of assessment where we do little meetings, actually, where I sit down with each of my students to see where they're at, trying to get them ready for kindergarten. It's, important that they're grasping what I'm teaching them in class. So sitting down with them to make sure that they are giving me their right understanding, and for the ones who aren't giving me their understanding, when they're not giving me a 1 or a 2, I sit them down.
Shannon, what about you? Do you use self-assessments?
So I definitely know what Jeanell was talking about with the 1, 2, 3. So when I was student teaching, I did use that. That's not something I use so much in my classroom now. It's a little too difficult for my students to understand how to do that. But something not pertaining to academics, but in terms of behavior, my students do a lot of self-assessment. So a lot of my students have behavior contracts. And like at the end of a half an hour, I'll tell them to review their contract. And in that time, they look and they say, okay, from 8:30 to 9, did I have a safe body? Yes. Did I have a quiet mouth? Yes. Were my feet on the floor? And they kind of assess how their behavior was for that half an hour. And then they have, a sheet where they document it. So I do use self-assessment in that way. And I think it's great because it's promoting, a high level skill that the students are, having to be in charge of their behavior and to, assess themselves. And if they're not happy with something, like make the appropriate changes. So I think self-assessment is a great tool. And like you said, I think I could see it being used in any type of classroom. And I think it's a nice skill that is a lifelong skill, obviously, to assess ourselves, even if it's not, so formal. I think we all assess ourselves all the time. So, yeah, I think that they're really important.
You were originally supposed to read chapter 8, but then I moved it to next week. But you had a question, so why don't we talk about it here?
So with rubrics, they mention rubrics to assess understanding. And like in our class, we have rubrics too. And I absolutely like rubrics. I feel like it's something that that could be used at all times. Obviously, I don't use them now because most of my students cannot read yet, but we're working on it. With rubrics, I feel like it's so important to have it alongside with them. And while student teaching, my cooperating teachers absolutely praised on having a rubric for everything. And even if it was in math, even if it was in history or science, they always had a rubric, obviously depending on the type of assignment. But my question was, how do you feel about rubrics, and do you use rubrics other than the traditional analytic rubric?
I was going to say, obviously, I have my own personal rubrics that I use to measure my students on, but it's not so much that they are aware of the rubric or that they're reading it. But in terms of our class, I think the rubrics are so helpful because it just gives a clear, expectation. So I think in terms of the teacher and in terms of the student, rubrics are really important because it kind of sets the groundwork. And it's, a concrete, almost concrete set of rules or things like that you need to make sure you accomplish if you want to receive this certain grade. I also think in terms of the teacher, it's great because it's like your rationale to explain a student's grade or explain something. So I think that rubrics are really important in any classroom. They just might be used differently.
Yeah, and that's also a self-assessment tool for yourself, right? Teachers being people who also would benefit from self-assessment. And I think they also talked about different kinds of rubrics where you have one kind where, I don't know if they have a name for it, but one kind where you just have a list of things. And then another one where you break it down by level, like proficient, whatever level wording you use, but breaking it down so that it's filled out a little bit more. And I think they definitely prefer the one that's filled out and more elaborate, but more helpful for the student.
Yeah, I remember in my undergrad learning about how there's a big difference between a rubric and a checklist. Like you're saying, a rubric is much more in depth, with a rationale almost, which I think is really helpful because that's what I was saying about how it for the teacher and for the student, it kind of helps them to be on the same page. The expectations are clear, and it's a way for the teacher to back up, the reasoning for their grade because there's a rationale provided.
Yeah, with using a checklist, which is like what you said, a type of assessment, I feel like it does allow you to see how they're doing well with not just that how they're doing well, but how they did on a written assignment. And I remember during my undergrad seeing that my cooperating teachers would use a checklist for math, making sure that if they had written out their problem in a detailed way, if they went ahead and wrote out the steps. And I feel like a checklist is a really great assessment or type of assessment to see if they're actually understanding what they're learning. For example, they had a paper that they had to write. And with that paper that they wrote, they asked a question like, does the paragraph state a topic sentence that states an opinion? And then so they would have to check yes or no. And it could be written out in different ways too.
Did that also have a rubric, or was that the rubric?
Well, that was a type of rubric for literacy. One for math that I've seen is a statement saying that, did you check your work after finishing the problem? And they would say yes or no.
Were there any other questions from the Wiggins and McTighe reading?
Just proposed an idea about, they mentioned the 3 basic questions to ask when you're thinking like an assessor.
What page is that?
It is on page 150. So basically, there are 3 questions that says, what kind of evidence do we need to find, to make sure that we're reaching our goals and that students are understanding? The second question is, what specific characteristics in the responses from the students or their performances should we examine to determine if things were achieved? And then the last one is, does the proposed evidence enable us to infer a student's knowledge, skill, or understanding? So I was just thinking, like, every week I have to submit my lesson plans. And like there's, lesson extensions in there. I provide all rationale. I put, goals, and I do put an assessment piece. But I was saying, I wonder if, administrators, if they had put more demand on maybe covering those 3 questions in your assessment when you submit it to them, if, that would help to lead teachers in the right direction to make sure that, they're not just putting down an assessment, but they're really digging deeper to make sure that their assessment is covering those 3 basic questions. So I was just thinking about how I would imagine in my school if the teachers were, mandated to provide that rationale and to cover those 3 questions, that, our assessments really would be much more meaningful and much more appropriate to measuring to see if the goal was really reached.
Do you think they'll be receptive to that?
I think if they understood how important assessment was, or if they kind of were exposed to some of this information that we were exposed to in these readings, that they might be, because I think I think it's going to make our jobs easier, because, if our assessments are centered around making sure we're reaching those questions, then a lot of our job right there is, completed. There could be data included in it and everything like that. And I just think it's a little bit more of a clear way to know if our students are reaching the goals or if they're not.
Yeah, it could even be like just a template. You don't even have to fill it out formally, but things you can think through. You can start with the major assignments maybe, and then have them think through it and then adjust it. Well, thank you both for spending time talking about these things. You two have very interesting kind of backgrounds to share, so I think that's really helpful. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.
Bye.